ways, it would be easy to get discouraged because it has been a long struggle, and we came very close in the late 70s to winning this fight. We didn't in the end. The other side came back, the war on drugs came full bore, and for about 20 years, they've been kicking our ass. I mean, we haven't won very many battles until about 96, when the tide started coming back our direction. So I wouldn't blame anyone if they're discouraged or jaded, or if they begin to doubt whether we can ever change things. But in fact, I will tell you that I am absolutely convinced that the momentum is now switched back in our direction again. The most obvious proof of that was in Oregon in November of 1998, when 67% of the voters in Oregon said, no, we do not want to arrest marijuana smokers. That wasn't just for medical use, that was for recreational use. And I don't think Oregon's the only state that would vote that way if the voters had a chance to vote on that issue. Our problem is that elected officials continue to act as if we're in the mid-50s and it's reefer madness. Now, part of that is because they came of age during a time when all they heard was zero tolerance and mandatory penalties and longer prison sentences, and marijuana arrests kept skyrocketing. So for a lot of politicians, they still believe that if they show any support for the...
Over the last few years, I've been through quite a voyage, discovery. I discovered marijuana when I was 15 years old. I didn't think it was any big deal. I certainly thought it was less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, even as a kid. So I never understood what the problem was. But when I came to High Times magazine, I wasn't a big pothead. I was like a weekend party guy. You hand me a joint, I'll take a hit on it, but I never had it, never paid for it, and really, I mean, I did in certain times of my life, but that wasn't where I was at. That wasn't why I came to High Times. I came to High Times because it's the only voice of the counterculture left. I feel like I'm a member of a community that came about in the 60s. And that community's been persecuted since basically its whole existence. And the drug laws is how the government persecutes minorities, and the counterculture is a minority group. And we have to recognize that, yeah, we are a minority group. And yeah, it's like all these laws that are designed to railroad us into jail, that's really, restricting us from having our culture, basically, because, this is our sacrament, and, we don't want to take sacraments away from anybody else, and we want freedom of religion in this country. So if we're going to have freedom of religion, we got to allow new spiritual cultures to emerge, nurture them, let them come to fruition. So this culture is only at its very beginnings. What I discovered at High Times first was it's not bad for you. People live longer if they use marijuana wisely. So, so what's the problem? Then we discovered, well, you can, make paper out of it, make your car out of it, make your clothes out of it. You know what I mean? There's the whole hemp thing. I go, why haven't we been told about this? And then, my latest thing is the birthing of all the major religions of the world takes place in Iran and India 5,000 years ago, and they're all drinking marijuana and milk. They call it bong, soma, hoioma, whatever you want to say. You can look at the formations of these great religions and you see marijuana cults there. And I believe this is true. It does create spiritual cultures, and we are a spiritual culture. It does play a role in our culture.
Let's not take any chances. But, with 80% of large companies doing testing, we've obviously gone way beyond the safety-sensitive occupations. When I was applying for low-wage jobs at the beginning of my experiment in low-wage living, for this article I was working on, I was surprised to see that Winn-Dixie, the southern supermarket chain, tests applicants for a $6 an hour job stacking Cheerio boxes. It was hard to see what could really go wrong with that job, no matter how inebriated, intoxicated, or stoned you were. Howard Johnson's test applicants for bed-making jobs, drug-free workplace. There you are. You just want a newspaper, right? Do you feel better? Do you feel reassured knowing that the person who makes your change for you is drug-free, or actually, how do we know drug-free? Isn't it probably is an alcoholic rather than a cokehead or something else, because they don't test to the kinds of jobs being tested for. Speaking of newspapers, though, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post all drug test their editors and their writers and their reporters. A practice which may actually make those newspapers less interesting, or at least help account for their unrelieved blandness all the time. You know, I don't care about who's testing the cashier, but I would like to know that the writers and the editors, or at least had enough, spine that they would have said no to a drug test. I'm not saying that druggies are necessarily better writers and editors. Maybe they are.
Maybe ACLU's pamphlet to you, because years ago, Len and I were involved in a case in which Motorola, who had initially only done, in a Boston plant, had only done pre-employment testing, began to move to random testing. And in those hearings, we got to present the claim that there is no proof that drug testing is a good investment. And Lynn began working very hard on looking at studies, outcome studies, claiming to show that drug use was a useless investment. And she brought all that work into fruition in writing this pamphlet, so I very highly recommend it to you. Again, these are not tests about the technical adequacy of testing. These are not tests to show whether one can find marijuana metabolite in the urine at a high rate of reproductivity. It's not a test to show whether we can find amphetamine metabolite or even unchanged amphetamine in urine, but a test, an scientific experiment to say, what difference does it make? Does it help? Whose name will always be dear to the hearts of some, because in the 1960s, Sidney Cohen turned on half of the white middle-class population of Los Angeles to LSD, all in the service of science. Sidney was a government physician, psychiatrist, very much involved in the early drug studies of the government. Sid turned in to be a terrible drug warrior at the end of his life, but early on he thought LSD would save the world. He was very prone to give it to people in Los Angeles. Lots and lots of people owe their beginning drug history to Sidney's casting about acid. I say all these things sorrowing that Sidney is dead, because I wish he were alive to answer some of these things. In his drug abuse newsletter, published in those days, he cited all the Firestone study figures, and people picked it up from him. In fact, he was the most important source of these numbers.
States by the U.S. government of drug use, what you find is the vast majority of users of every drug use occasionally. They're not addicts, they're not daily users, they use once a month, a couple times a year, they're not hardcore users. And so the fact is, the vast majority of users can use these drugs responsibly. And because we face that reality, we have designed a drug war that assumes everybody's an abuser. And so, and because we have that false premise, the policies don't fit, they don't work.
And furthermore, carrying
these, 90% of those cases have this starting point as a dirty needle. And so even among kids, babies born, it's injection drug use. Look at the international scene. We're now getting involved in a war in Colombia, a 4-decade-old civil war. And in a civil war where both sides, the right and the left, have been involved in drug trafficking. We're picking one side or the other. We like the right-wing drug traffickers better than left-wing drug traffickers. It means that, for example, a heroin user is going to be using in a shooting gallery rather than the clinic. It means that a marijuana user is going to be likely to be hiding from parents and authorities and therefore smoking in a car, increasing the risk of a negative result. So the stigmatization of drug users actually makes things worse. And we have spent, as a federal government only, about $200 billion on the drug war. $200 billion with a B. And if you add the state and local governments, it's about equal to that. So you're talking approaching $500 billion. We have the record high overdose deaths last year. We had near record high emergency room admissions. The year before was the record. Near record high emergency room admissions of drugs at the hospitals. Half of new AIDS cases coming from IV drug use. 90%.
Just when we were our most vulnerable, they held up this load. Then they went and did an audit of Kennex's shipments into the United States over the last 6 months, realized that they shipped 17 loads of various hemp products into the United States. horse bedding, hemp nut, hemp seed oil, and products like that. And they did a customs recall demanding, under the pain of a $900,000 fine, that you see the partner to its inner nut. And that is the key that's going to make hemp available to industries in the United States. We don't have to cook the seeds. But before I continue to sing praises for Canada and what's going on up there, and I know David will too, I better answer one question. So if hemp is not equal to marijuana, if you can't get high from it, it has nothing to do with drugs, why are you speaking here at the normal conference? Okay? So I've come up with 7 reasons why. 7 reasons why the confusion between hemp and marijuana gets in our way. Okay? One is this understanding that industrial hemp is the root cause of incorporating laws against marijuana into our